Welcome back. Well, now we're going to plunge into kind of the meat and potatoes of this course, which is hypothesis testing. This is one way that we make decisions in statistics. And rather than just go through how we do a hypothesis test, it's useful to have some background information. One of the things that can be very confusing about hypothesis tests is the fact that they're word problems. And if you don't understand how to take apart the word problem and what the word problems are about, things can become kind of fuzzy. So to start off with, I want to show you a hypothesis test that you already did, although you didn't know it. We didn't call it a hypothesis test. And I'm going to go through the general problem that we're interested in a hypothesis test and then show you the steps that we did in the discussion with the error barometer data. So first of all, we have a population. And in the error barometer, you got to choose a particular country. And so let's say I choose Morocco. My population is all the adult citizens in Morocco. And then you chose a binary categorical variable, or you chose a categorical variable and made it binary. And let's say I chose the question whether or not they have a cell phone. And then you chose a category of interest. You chose one of those values of the categorical variable. And generally, we're interested in yes, whether they do. And finally, you have a parameter. You have a parameter for that categorical variable, which is the population percentage. And in the context of my hypothetical problem with the error barometer, what I'd be interested in is the percentage of all Moroccans that fall into my category of interest. That is, they have cell phones and smartphones. And the goal here is that we want to test the value of the population's parameter. So we have some value in mind, and we want to test it. And in the error barometer, remember that you made an educated guess. That's what a hypothesis is. And you tested it versus the sample data. And so I could make an educated guess, maybe 50%. And I could test whether the percentage of people in Morocco that had cell phones is greater than 50%. And so this gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're doing here in hypothesis test. But it also points out something important that you want to do when you always start any hypothesis test, which is you want to understand the context of the problem. One of the difficulties that students run into is they read this word problem and they get confused and they have no idea where to start, and they just start trying to plug numbers into formulas. And that's the exact opposite of what you want to do. There's a very low likelihood you're going to get the right answer. What you have to do is take the problem apart. You have to get your bearings. I have to do this. Okay? And I've been doing this longer than most of you have been alive. When I read a problem, this is the thought process that I have to go through. You have to make sense of the problem. And so what you're going to do is you're going to identify in this order: parameter, variable, population. Because you can generally pick out the parameter first. It's either a percentage or a mean. And then the variable, percentage of what? That's your variable. And who is that percentage relevant to? That's your population. So you're actually working backwards when you read a problem. Normally, when we create a problem, we start, who are we interested in? What are we interested in? Those people about, that's the variable. And then finally, what is the parameter? But when you read a problem, you go the other way. Okay. One of the things that's also very useful is to understand how hypothesis tests arise. And the reason why is there are a lot of different scenarios in which you can see hypothesis tests. And there are some assumptions that are implicit when we work these different types of problems. So there are three common scenarios, at least for the purposes of this class, where we're going to use hypothesis testing. The first situation is where we have some sort of change that occurred, and we want to see if it affected our population. And so we're going to work through this sample problem. Florida repealed the mandatory motorcycle helmet law in 2000. We know what the injury rate before the repeal occurred. It was 80%. And what we want to see is after the change occurred, after the law was repealed, did the percentage of people who were injured in accidents change? Okay. So this is what we're testing. We're just testing to see if pi is not equal to 80%. Now you might say, oh, you should be testing to see if it increased. So we're going to take a conservative point of view. It might have increased because people weren't as protected as far as their heads go, but it might have decreased. Maybe people became more cautious. Okay, so we're just going to see if it changed. Now, the other sort of scenario is when we're testing a manufacturer's claim. So an example we're going to look at is a claim put out by Colgate that 4 out of 5 dentists recommend their toothpaste. We're going to see that is a kind of disingenuous sort of ad. The wording is a little misleading. And whenever we test a manufacturer's claim, we test against the claim. So Colgate's claiming at least 80% of the dentists recommend Colgate. We're going to test the opposite. We're going to test less than. And this, by the way, is how class action lawsuits come about. Really serious law firms like Morgan & Morgan that specialize in class action lawsuits, they have attorneys on their staff. And this is part of the calculation to go through. I consult. I'm part of a group that consults for lawyers in this sort of situations. And this is the sort of work that we would do in those sorts of cases. So this is a very common application. We also might want to see if a population has a certain property. So in the George Floyd discussion, we talked about racism. Does a population, are they racist? Are Americans racist? Okay. We're going to look at the example and the introduction with the mice. And we're going to ask, are rats empathetic? Okay. Rats and mice, they aren't the same thing. I know that. Interestingly enough, in University of Chicago study, they call them rats. And usually they call them mice, but we'll use it interchangeably. We won't be too picky. And so how are we going to define whether or not a population is empathetic? Well, we're going to say that if the majority of the population would exhibit empathetic behavior, we're going to say the population was empathetic. And notice again, empathy is one of those things like racism. We can't measure it directly. Okay, so these experimenters had to be very clever and find a proxy, something that they thought indicated the presence of empathy. And they did it by using this experiment with the caged rat and the free rat. All right, so let's try to understand the logic behind how a hypothesis test works. We start off with two competing hypotheses. The first is called the null hypothesis. And we denote that by H for hypothesis and subscript 0. And the reason why is null means nothing. And so what we're saying is that nothing happened. So if we're looking at that first scenario where we're testing to see if a change occurred, the null is going to assume that no change occurred. So in our example, we're going to assume that the population percentage has the same value it had before the change, which in that problem was 80%. If we're looking at the scenario with the manufacturer's claim, the assumption is that the manufacturer's claim is met. And so in that case, we would assume that the percentage of all dentists who recommended Crest was at least 80%. If we're testing to see if a property exists in a population, the assumption under the null hypothesis is that the population does not have that property. So in the rat empathy example, we would be assuming that the majority of rats are not empathetic. In other words, pi is less than or equal to 50% in that problem. And so Sometimes people call the null hypothesis the no news hypothesis. It's the thing that if it happened, you wouldn't write a news story, okay? If no change occurred in the motorcycle injury rate, people probably wouldn't write a news story about it. If a manufacturer met their claim, and this happens every day with 1,000 products, right? We don't write news articles about them. If rats are not empathetic, we wouldn't write a news article about them. Why? Because the null is our default assumption. It's what we would assume anyhow, in the absence of any data. So without any data, these are the things that we would assume. So they're not newsworthy, so to speak. They're not significant. On the other hand, we have the alternative hypothesis. And again, we denote it with a capital H. And there are two different types of notations. So the one is H with a subscript 1. That's what our text uses. And that's what you'll most likely see in the homework problems. But sometimes they also use a subscript A for alternative. And I do borrow problems from other texts sometimes, so you may see H sub A. And the alternative is saying, no, something did happen, something new happened. And the key thing about the alternative is it's what we're trying to prove. If you read old statistics articles, they used to refer to the alternative hypothesis as the research hypothesis. And that's actually a much better word, a much better term. And the reason why is because it's the research question you're trying to prove. Okay? So if we go to our examples, okay, and we're looking to see if a change occurred, the alternative is that a change did occur. In the case of the motorcycle accident, it would be saying the population percentage is no longer 80%. If we're looking at a manufacturer's claim, the alternative would be saying that they didn't meet their claim, in which case the population percentage would be less than 80%. And finally, when we're looking at some sort of property that we want to show the population has, the alternative would be saying it does have that property. Or in this case, for the rat empathy, the percentage of rats that exhibited empathetic behavior would be 50%, would be above 50%. So it's important when you're doing these hypothesis tests to form the hypothesis also, okay? And so, again, a good thing to do is to sit down and identify the type of problem. Am I looking at a change that occurred? Am I testing a manufacturer's claim? Or am I looking to see if a population has some sort of property? The last thing I want to do, and this is going to kind of set up what we're going to do in the subsequent videos, is I want to outline the process that we use when we do a hypothesis test. And we're going to see, interestingly enough, that process is very similar to what goes on in a court trial, say for murder. And so to start off with, we state our hypotheses. In a court trial, the two sides state their positions, right? The null says nothing happened. It's what we would believe by default if we had not collected any data. And that corresponds to the not guilty plea. Nothing happened. I didn't do it. And again, it's what we believe in the absence of evidence. When you come in as a defendant in a court of law, you are presumed innocent. If the prosecutor comes in and says, I have nothing, you walk out of the court a free person 100% of the time. So in the absence of any evidence, we believe the person is not guilty. On the other hand, the alternative is saying the opposite. And it's important to understand, though, before we go on to the alternative, that the null hypothesis is our initial belief, just in the same way that not guilty is our initial belief. It's what we believe by default. Now, the alternative says something did happen, and again, it's what we're trying to prove. It's actually the purpose of the study. And of course, that corresponds in a court of law to the prosecutor. Prosecutor says, I believe they're guilty, and that's what you're trying to prove in a court of law. Okay, what happens next? Well, in a statistical hypothesis test, we check our data. We want to make sure it satisfies the central limit theorem, and then we compute the sample estimate. And that corresponds in a court of law to presenting evidence and making sure it's admissible. It's important to understand that the data is always in favor of the alternative. In the same way that all of the evidence that's presented in a court of law is in favor of the prosecutor, right? There has to be a reason why they bring you in to court to charge you for murder. They can't just pull a random person off the street. Okay, there has to be a grand jury that issues an indictment initially. So in the same way, there's some evidence that the alternative is true. So the sample estimate is always evidence in favor of the alternative. Now, making sure it's admissible. So in a court of law, one of the things that the defendant does is they challenge whether or not it's admissible. And if the evidence was not collected properly, they have to throw it out. In the same way, with a statistical hypothesis test, if the data was not collected properly, and not collected properly corresponds to the conditions that we need to satisfy in the central limit theorem in order to use it. Remember the conditions of the central limit theorem from module 5, right, and 6 were that we had a good sample. It had to be random and large enough, right? Now, what is the next step? Well, the next step is we're going to test the null hypothesis. So the way that we do a hypothesis test is we test the null. And what we ask is, if the null hypothesis is really true, how likely is it we could get our observed sample estimate? In a court of law, even though it's not quite as quantitative as in a statistical hypothesis test, they're going through the same mental calculus, right? As the prosecutor keeps presenting more and more evidence, the jurors are doing this mental calculation, and they're asking, if a person really was innocent, how likely is it they could have all this evidence against them? And they're doing this kind of weighing sort of process, right? And finally, we make a decision. So if it turns out that the sample is too unlikely to occur if the null was true, we reject the null. But if it's not too unlikely, if we could get the sample estimate, if the null was true, it's not that unlikely we could have got it, we're going to fail to reject it. And this corresponds to a court of law, where if it's too unlikely we could get all that evidence against the defendant if they were really not guilty, we find them guilty. We flip, right? We say, now with all this evidence, it's too unlikely that you could be not guilty, and they flip, and they render a verdict of guilty. If there's some evidence, but not enough, we find them not guilty. We don't say they're innocent. We're just saying there wasn't enough evidence to convict them. And we're going to actually kind of flesh out this analogy, and I think it's a really nice kind of concrete way of understanding what's going on behind the numbers when we do a hypothesis test. So stay tuned.